Daily Show with CJ Nasello on RiverBender.com.
Right around 10:30 on this beautiful Wednesday morning, the 11th day of October in the heart of the 618. You know, time and time again the last month, folks, we've had so many great conversations with individuals from all over this country. And Robert Riggs is a Peabody Award-winning journalist. And, sir, you have had such an extensive career. To join us here in downtown Alton today and fill us in on some things is really cool. I hope your Wednesday's going well in Dallas.
Well, it is. My wife was in a national championship horse show in Oklahoma City and did great. And we go back tomorrow for more. So we're real happy. I'm from an old horse family, and she's new to it, but she's the great horseman in the family now.
That's incredible. My family had some race horses themselves, not with the pageantry, but more of the racing. And to me, honestly, before we go into it, I think horses are the most intelligent animals too, and just really an art form if you can work with them correctly.
Well, you know, many people are intimidated by their size. They're very much like a dog, very similar to a dog. Even in terms of smell, their olfactory glands and stuff. When they lick you, they then lick the upper part of their mouth, and which connects to their nasal passages, and they're actually smelling you when they lick you.
I didn't realize that. Wow. Well, yeah. And, you know, Robert, I was going through your website and going through the lineage and just some of the really just amazing things you're able to accomplish, go see and report on for all of us here. And, you know, I figured with all the, you know, just terrible acts being committed in Israel and all that's going on right now, I figured just to start and ask you about your time covering some of these conflicts that you did cover, including the Iraq War, the Gulf War, and, you know, go on the list. I was curious to know your time and how that came about, how you found yourself you know, reporting coverage and documenting it on the front line.
Well, the background, what kind of drove it was that I'm a graduate of Texas A&M. It's one of the oldest military schools in the country, although it's civilian now. When I went there, it was transitioning from compulsory military to, you know, co-eds and else. But my uncle that I'm named after had gone there, and he was highly decorated in World War II. His class got called up from there. And, you know, my father, uncles, they were all World War II veterans. And so, you know, there was that interest. You know, you always kind of, Dad, what'd you do during the war? My grandfather served in World War II along with my father. Then out of there, I ended up working in Congress, and I ended up as a staffer on a defense committee, one of the defense committees there. And you went to military schools related to that. And again, it just kind of fed that interest. And so then when I became a correspondent, and I was covering the Reagan White House and the George H.W. Bush White House, and in that time period covering the Pentagon and Capitol Hill. Well, President Reagan had his 600-ship Navy going and the buildup. And, you know, he believed in peace through strength. That was one of his mottos. And so, you know, it was during that that I was covering those things. I had, at that time frame, I covered briefly the Contra War in Nicaragua. That was a proxy war between the U.S. and the Soviets. Nicaragua had a communist socialist regime and still do. Then I did Gulf War I. I was embedded with 1st Cav out of Fort Hood. And then when it came around to 2003, at that point I'd left the media. Mm-hmm. And but the management team I'd worked for had taken over a CBS station, and they wanted me to come there and be part of the CBS station group, you know, where your stuff would appear around the country. And I said, I have one condition. We're going to go to war in Iraq, and I want to do it. And so that took me there. Wow. After that experience, I was embedded with a unit, but after it, my producer and I decided, look, we really want to dig into terrorism. And interestingly, before the war, I had done some terrorism reporting with Osama bin Laden and all that back in like 1998. Wow. And so we really dug in. We started a very, very popular blog, and about it. And where I'm going with this is today, the big target of our investigation was Hamas. Hamas in Richardson, Texas, they had a group called the Holy Land Foundation, which was kind of a front for their illicit activities. And they were running computer servers. They had a computer thing there. And we found out that those servers were being used to host videos that were coming out of Birmingham, England, trying to recruit soldiers. Their soldiers, their terrorists, to kill U.S. soldiers with roadside bombs. And that really set us on that path. And we did a lot of reporting. Eventually, the FBI came in and they prosecuted some of the people. But, you know, the person running it here, his brother was the leader of Hamas. Wow. So we did a lot of extensive reporting. We had sources that went inside hotel meetings they were having in ballrooms, and it was all aimed at, it really wasn't, you know, it's interesting, it's not really just anti-Israel, it's anti-Jews. And it's, you know, it's, if you look at their manifesto, it's about killing Jews. It's about eliminating Jews from the face of the earth. So, I mean, I think that's what you see with the slaughter going on today.
Absolutely. Well, without a doubt. And sir, with all the investigative reporting that you've done on this and just leading up to it, could you ever foresee something, you know, that's occurring today happening when you were first, you know, kind of covering what was going on in Texas? Did you foresee this, or was this something that even, you know, for Hamas is a little bit out of, you know, on a grander scale?
You know, especially after 9/11, nothing surprises me anymore.
Yeah.
Nothing after that. And, you know, when we were embedded, you know, there was a time you felt like journalists were off limits, you know, we got a pass, they were neutral. But, you know, I began to see, even in the Gulf War, that wasn't the case anymore. If you were an American, you were a target.
Wow.
And, you know, I'm trying to think of his name. It was a CBS correspondent, great correspondent. They decided in Gulf War I to venture into Iraq themselves, and they got taken hostage. And I think they were pretty brutally beaten and treated until they were released.
Wow.
And during our invasion of Iraq in 2003, up in the middle of the country, we picked up 3 freelance journalists who were blackened, just covered with black and scraped and everything else. And they had decided that to just come in on their own, freelance, not with the military, not approved by the military. And the paramilitary group of Saddam, called the Fedayeen, attacked them. And their car blew up. They hid all night in a drainage ditch, and finally we were coming through and we picked them up, and, you know, they were a mess, but it just confirmed, you know, you're American, they're going to come get you. And I had I'll tell you, I had a close experience to my crew and I getting shot or executed when we were in Honduras covering the Contras. And it was from that moment on, I said, I will never do this unless I'm with the United States military. I knew that there would be medical care, there would be fresh water, hygiene, that sort of stuff. But, you know, today, if you turn on CNN and Fox and the others, you will see reporters out there. Their crews are out there on their own. Now, you always have locals that are called fixers, but they know everything. They know the ground, and they can really, really help you. Mm-hmm. But, you know, I had a close call that taught me a lesson. And then even with the unit I was in Iraq, you know, we suffered the first casualties. We got hit by friendly fire from an F-16, which rang my bell. And, you know, so I still have a few issues today, 20 years later from it. Wow. So you weren't totally safe. You're still in a war zone.
Well, and I think that's what sometimes I think people, you know, don't not understand, but don't realize is, these reporters are out here and they're in just as much danger sometimes as the soldiers and the folks fighting the, actual conflict in that war. And what are your thoughts for, the likes of, I was just talking to you about Trey Yingst, who was doing a live hit and interceptor missiles are coming over him and he's getting his crew down to, the folks on CNN and all these major networks that are out there, reporting and documenting this in such a dangerous situation. What are your thoughts, just for them?
Well, this is going to sound odd, but there's certain personalities that thrive on this. There is an adrenaline rush. It's the best of times and the worst of times if you're embedded, and because when you're embedded, you get to know the soldiers in the unit. I mean, you know them as people. It's not just like if you're covering a car wreck and it's some anonymous person killed on the side of the road, and that hits you hard. But, it's best of times, worst of times. There is when we went to Iraq, the three of us, we were all older guys. We'd seen a lot. My producer had been on the West Bank and been in violence. My cameraman, Billy Sexton, he had been a Marine combat photographer in Gulf War I. And then, you heard what I'd done. I'd been Gulf War I and the Contras. And so we had seen it. And it was so interesting. We were in this unit. We were the oldest people in the unit, older than the battalion commander. And with the exception of a new person they had sent over, we're the only ones that had been in combat and seen things. And they'd sent a great guy over from the 82nd Airborne. He was a command sergeant major named Kevin, Kevin McCarthy. Anyways, he was a soldier, and he'd been in combat. And we were with a Patriot missile unit, and usually they were back at the rear. They weren't this time, but they were techies, and they didn't really think of themselves as infantrymen. Unlike the Marines, the Marines, it's interesting. Everybody in the Marines, if you're a cook, a medic, no matter what you are, your first job, you're considered a rifleman first. So that's kind of their mentality, their ethos. But in the unit we were in, it wasn't. And so this command sergeant major had come over from, I believe, the 82nd Airborne to kind of instill the discipline and all for the fight. And they really weren't heavily armed. And so we could tell, because you're living with them beforehand, before the invasion, we could tell people they had no idea what was coming. The leadership did. Some of the officers did. But, I'll tell a story. I remember being in a Humvee. This is with my crew before the war kicked off. And we were with a lieutenant who had graduated from the West Point, who'd been on the football team. And I said, Lieutenant, what's your proficiency with the M16? And he laughed about it. He didn't think that he would even need it. I'll never need it here. Well, yeah, they needed it.
Wow.
And the crew and I looked at each other like, he has no idea what's coming.
What's it like to be in that spot, though, where you kind of, and then, you're talking to somebody that has obviously no idea what's getting ready to happen. I mean, what's the thought there? What do you do?
Yeah, it was funny. Before we kicked off, there was a captain who came over, and they were getting intelligence that things were going to be bad. They were going to suffer heavy casualties. And he said, I'd like to put M16s in your Humvee. And as in the embedding reporter agreement, there are a number of things you agreed to, such as you would not report your location. Many of us were reporting live. And, that's a self-preservation issue right there.
Right.
You would not report malfunctions with equipment to give the enemy advantage, and you wouldn't be armed. And so he came over and said this, and my producer just got hot under the collar, said, absolutely not. We signed an embedding agreement. We're not combatants. We're not doing it. And I looked at him. I said, "Look, Billy here, the cameraman. He was in the Marine Corps. He knows the M16. I know the M16 from when I worked in Congress and went to schools and stuff. But I said I do know that it has a problem sometimes in the dirt of jamming. Just take the two of us out here and refresh our memory on how to unjam it. And if things get bad, if we're being overrun, we'll find an M16.
Right.
Well, we're not going to put it in here but we'll find it. It means self-preservation. And if you ever saw that show about the Vietnam conflict called "They Were Soldiers," Mel Gibson, and that's a real story that really happened. I remember even studying it when I was in Congress. Well, there was a journalist there, and he picked up a gun and started fighting.
Wow.
And that was all true. But it was like, if you didn't do it, you weren't going to leave there alive. So, we did that. And then after getting ambushed all night on a road and stuff, and the next morning, my producer said, "Hey, take me over here and show me how to use that."
Oh, I bet. Well,
Yeah.
and it goes back to what you just said, I'm sure, is, at that situation, it's unfortunately a kill or be killed situation, or, a fight or end up not coming home potentially. What are you going to do? And, Robert, I was going to ask you, through all the conflicts you've covered, is there one that just hits you, more so than any of the others? I'm sure they all have their moments, and I'm sure that there's different points in the Gulf War and different points in Iraq and in the Contra. But is there one that, just time and time again you look back on with either, angst or any type of just, kind of thoughts about it that just stick with you?
Well, it's 2003 because of 9/11, and I had never been shot at up close and personal. The Gulf War was an artillery war. You remember it ended in a few hours on the ground because of the air battle that had taken place. But this time, shot at up close and personal, and you knew everybody. And so there were casualties in the unit, and you knew everyone. And I'll tell you, the show Band of Brothers. And my father and uncles had talked about that whole band, that camaraderie. I can tell you that when you're under fire and you're in that situation, you really do become bonded together.
Well, I'm sure.
And, I know they say I remember at the military war college, they were talking about, you're not fighting for God at the end of the day. You're not fighting for country. You're fighting for that man or woman that's beside you to survive.
Absolutely. Well, and honestly, I can 100% agree, and see how you would become, banded together, especially in those very tense situations too. And now, as you're, we're talking here, and I sent you an email and said, I would like to talk about, government stealing secrets from each other, because I do find that very fascinating with surveillance and all the ins and outs. But, with all this going on in Israel, I felt like this would be the better way to start the conversation, is to talk to someone that was there and has done this. And the one transitioning question I have to ask you is, do you cover, whenever you're going through multiple conflicts like you've done, is there I don't want to say a template, but is there almost a rubric or a guideline that you had with you, almost mentally going, all right, here's where we need to be? Or is it something that you just have to be in the situation at that location and that conflict to figure out?
First and foremost, it was like, don't be stupid.
Yeah. Yeah.
Don't take an unnecessary risk. Be and think. But the way we looked at, and all the things I did was, I'm here with this unit. It's about the men and women in the unit. And this is kind of I don't know the big picture. I'm not sitting back covering the Pentagon. I'm going to tell you the perspective of the war, what's happening in this unit. Did it that way. Yeah.
Absolutely.
And I went back, and I tell you, for this war, I went back and read a lot of the work of some of the great World War II war correspondents. I even went back and read the work of Edward R. Murrow, the famous CBS correspondent from World War II. reading his work, just kind of getting a sense what were they, what did they focus in on? And so that's what we did. It was about the people.
Wow. Well, and Robert, with that being said, on top of everything else that you've done, and whether or not it's covering conflicts to covering, the White House to, going all the way down the list, as we're kind of transitioning here now, more than halfway through, I'm sure with everything going on in terms of, Russia, Ukraine, you got Israel and Hamas, there's always that, surveillance game of, trying to gain the upper hand and stealing some secrets or maybe obtaining some of the keys to their success in this battle. Whenever we talk about something like that, what is the best way to define that? The government's, stealing secrets from each other. Does that come in terms of surveillance? Does it come in terms of leaks? Does it come in terms of hacking on a cyber scale? What's that kind of look like?
Well, there's what they call human intelligence. Then there's electronic intelligence, and it covers a broad spectrum of things. This is a long time ago, but when I worked in Congress, one of my office mates had been in naval intelligence. There are other people in there had been in the CIA. And, we had fleets of submarines that did nothing but electronic intelligence, sneaking into Soviet ports and taking pictures of, for instance, the prop on an aircraft carrier, because the engineers could then back design the prop, and they could tell you what the performance of the aircraft, how fast it could go, what the propulsion system was. Other units, it's really, I remember when I came in as a young staffer, just my mind, a young kid, right. Mind blown by everything, because I ended up with a top secret security clearance. But, there were, quote, across Turkey, Air Force listening post that did nothing but every time the Soviets launched a ballistic missile, they sucked in all the telemetry data. That's the electronic data going from the missile to the ground and from the ground to the missile. And it would be analyzed to determine, what's the weight of it? What could it be the weight of the warhead? How fast does it go? Where can it go? Down to I can remember being a congressional staffer and seeing the satellite photos of you can almost pick out a pack of cigarettes on the street in Moscow. The powerfulness of the satellite photos and the satellite photos of Russian ships in port and stuff like that. And then you've got the National Security Agency, the NSA, with others, but they're the principal ones. They're gathering the electronic data constantly. There's aircraft that are gathering it to analyze. There was a moment where the capability of the U.S. really got exposed back. This is when I was covering the Reagan White House. Do you remember the Korean jetliner got shot down by a MiG fighter? And the Russians tried to deny that, they had done it and everything else. Well, we were sucking in electronic data from everywhere. And so like a day later or 2 days later, Reagan released a recording of the MiG pilot talking to the base and getting instructions to shoot the plane down. It's amazing. Now, it exposed just how good our system was, but Reagan felt it was important for the world to know. And, the technology has gone so far beyond that since then. But look how Israel was surprised. And I'm presuming our intelligence agencies were surprised. And my kind of speculation is that Hamas was using old-fashioned messaging methods of people carrying messages and moving messages and never putting anything out on cell phones or any of that sort of stuff.
And with that, is it one of those things where as countries evolve, do they forget about some of those, early, forms of communication? I won't say early, but more of those kind of traditional forms of communication. Do those just get overlooked when you're in that situation because of all the advancements in technologies? You forget about a few of those, you think?
I think so. I can see that you kind of get married to what's working and what you're into. And you have other, you got younger generations doing it and who
Yep.
maybe don't have the depth of experiences of the past to know.
Well, and on top of that too, I don't want to put you on the spot with this. It's just a question because I keep seeing this brought up time and time again, and I figured you know a lot more about this than I do, and that is when it comes to you have pundits on the news right now talking about the $6 billion that was unfrozen just about 9 days ago. Do you see that as a correlating factor to why this conflict, arose the way it did, or was that just one of those things that happened, but this was already in motion, months or years ago?
My understanding is, although it had been unfrozen, it had never been released. The money had not been sent. What I believe the correlation is that the Saudis were on the verge of doing an agreement with Israel, and it would have, in essence, making peace and having a relationship, and it would suddenly have changed the whole political dynamics of the Middle East. And the Saudis are Sunni, and the Iranians are Shiites, and they hate each other. It goes way, way back in that religion. And so I think it was more about that. I think it was more about trying to just upset that agreement. Is also this is like the 50th anniversary of Yom Kippur, that surprise attack. So I think that played into it as well.
Very fascinating. And like I said, I wasn't saying I knew it just, whenever I know that somebody has a little bit more insights on something, I always like to ask you, because I'm not the expert and I don't, try to be either. And as we circle back to Robert, this has been such a great conversation and such a good one too. Really cool to hear some of these insights. I got to ask you, over all the things you've done covering the Reagan White House, which I'm sure would have been just a really cool thing to be a part of and just, kind of witnessing, all the way down to working in Congress and beyond. What was the one moment, that one time period that you felt most suited in what you were doing? Was it the Reagan administration? Was it all the interviews that you've done, throughout your career? What's the selling point, the sticking point for Robert Riggs and your tenure?
Well, it's so interesting, like covering President Reagan, George H.W. Bush, other things on Capitol Hill. I covered all the peace treaty agreements that Reagan was doing with the Soviets to reduce the nuclear arsenal and stuff. You don't realize until years later, you were really there at a moment of history. That's not occurring to you then. But as far as stories and reporting that are consequential, I go back to the 1990s, and I exposed a corruption scandal in the Texas parole and prison system, in which they were letting inmates that had been on death row out, and they were committing new crimes, and one of them was a serial killer, should have never gotten out. There were even allegations there was a cloud of corruption over his release. The day he walked out, he started murdering women again on a 3-year spree. But I exposed all of that, and my reporting prompted a nationwide manhunt for him. The reporting led to a complete overhaul of the criminal justice system in Texas. Wow. It led to Governor Ann Richards and members of the Senate getting behind the largest prison expansion in history. And I started a true crime podcast in late 2020, and the first 17 parts are about that killer. Wow. He's probably one of the worst serial killers in U.S. history. That's not just for me. I was told that by some of the behavioral science unit investigators at the FBI that you've never heard of. There were a number of things. He was always overshadowed. But I did that. Then we did a television documentary about him called Freed to Kill. It's on Fox Nation streaming. It's been it's won a number of awards. It's been a hit there. It really is a documentary about what happens if you let violent career offenders back on the streets and the danger of putting people in. So there were so many changes around that. And that's really got me on the kind of back on the crime beat now of doing other shows, podcasts. We're doing things with Texas Rangers, former retired U.S. Marshals, sheriffs here, homicide detectives. So on my podcast, which is called True Crime Reporter, when you hear it, you hear from the real investigators. We're not reading something that we've taken off the internet or plagiarized from a book. And frankly, I believe most true crime podcasts are doing that.
Yes.
You're going to hear the real people, the real story from out of their mouth.
Wow. And honestly, I did not and this is just showing you how much of a long day it's been over here in Alton, Robert. I did not realize that you were behind Freed to Kill. I've watched that before, and it's just fantastic. I mean, really just a fantastic piece. And, before I let you go, we got about 4 minutes, and this is, I have to ask you, is there any story from the Reagan administration or even the H.W. Bush one that you maybe can tell now that you've, had to keep under the lid, or just one of those? Because to me, I don't know if this happens. I always imagine as the president of the United States, there's always some weird things that happen to lead to, whether or not a bill is getting passed or whether or not some action's being taken on an item. Were there ever any of those weird circumstances in a White House that you covered that led to an overhaul or a bill being passed or any type of conflict resolution?
Well, when I worked in Congress, then later I'm correspondent covering Congress. My wife worked in Congress too. And it is nothing like the institution today. They actually, they got things done.
Yeah.
You really didn't speak ill of anyone else. That was very rare. I'll tell you a funny story. I mean, there's stories like this. There was a Congressman named Wayne Hayes, and Hayes became chairman of the House Administration Committee. Well, nobody wanted that chairmanship. They thought, well, that's a dull committee. There's, they're not doing big public policy issues. What it was is that you were in control of office space, office supplies, other printing, the printing presses, parking, and all. But he was quite a politician. And what he realized is that, look, I can hold this over members' heads, and if they don't vote for my bill, I'm going to punish them by turning off the lights in their office. And he was doing this kind of stuff. He was really
wow.
There was a funny side to him that was mean. And I we were young guys, and I knew a guy that worked on his staff, and I'll never forget, he asked us to go to dinner with Wayne Hayes one evening, and we're at a very popular, where all the politicians hung out, steakhouse, and he was kind of like the Rodney Dangerfield of the room. And it was funny, but boy, it was a lot of expensive other people. And it was a great story that some member really had gotten up and got the votes to block this bill that he really wanted for his district. And when that member showed up the next day to park in the Rayburn House office building, the officer stopped him and said, "No, you don't have parking here." What are you talking about? I've had parking in here for years. And, well, you don't have it anymore. Well, where am I supposed to park? And he says, well, according to Wayne Hayes, you're to park up in Maryland. Yeah. So he'd taken all their parking spaces.
Wow.
Teaching them a lesson. Now, the funny side of this is that eventually he had a secretary in one of the committees, a buxom blonde named Elizabeth Ray. Google it. She was an aspiring entertainer. And so she came out with a big spread in the Washington Post leak that she was his mistress and she didn't know how to type. She didn't know how to type. I'd seen stuff. And then, so that cost him his job. He got ousted from office. That sort of stuff then, that was it. Wow. And then she went on and attempted to be a Las Vegas singer and really didn't have the voice for it. Well, but I used to be amused by stuff like that anymore. It seemed, I think, would have been a more fun place to cover or work than now when everybody's it's a blood sport.
Well, you're absolutely right. And Robert Riggs, as time's running out, I can't thank you so much for your time. And, if you ever have any time to come back on again and fill us in on even more insights, I'd love to have you, sir. Thank you so much.
Sure. Thank you. You ever got any questions about this thing? Just give me a call. I love to come on and talk about the past.
Absolutely.
Or the future.
And okay. We'd love to have you, seriously. We'll take a quick break here on this 11th day of October. Yeah, it is October, isn't it, Robert? I think.
Oh, gosh, I hope it is.
Oh,
'cause
man.
I got all the Halloween decorations left.
Well, I was putting up my Thanksgiving stuff, so I got to take it down. So while I do that, we'll take a quick break. Daily Show on a Wednesday continues next in the heart of the 618.